always ask the same question of my guests to kick things off, just to give us a little bit of a sense of your story, your background, the saga of Rohini. So when you think back to some of the messages that you received early in life that really shaped you and your identity, your sense of self, the way that you show up in the world, what are some of those messages that come to mind for you?
Yeah, so Maria, I actually grew up in Mumbai, India, and I am the eldest of three sisters. My mother was a homemaker, but is a very strong woman. She's almost 90 now, lives by herself. She started an international school along with other mothers in India. She started a nonprofit organization. So just, very powerful, very strong. My father studied in the United States in the 1940s. He came to the US on a scholarship and actually had a scholarship in physics in Chicago, and went to Chicago, University of Chicago. It was too cold for him, so he said he wanted to move to California because he had heard that California is warmer, which we know it is. And so the only scholarship available was in film, and he said, I'll take it. He had never handled a camera in his life. He took this scholarship, went to University of Southern California, and his first job out of school was in Hollywood. And he has some great pictures with the likes of Cary Grant, etc. And I share all that to say that he obviously had a wonderful experience despite the racism and the prejudice that he encountered, particularly in the South, driving to the southern United States. But he encouraged me as a single woman to go to the United States and study. Now, the messages I received from both my parents were that, women can do anything. And that certainly has been, something that has shaped my career and how I have ventured into the world. I worked for the National Multicultural Institute, which is where you and I met, and I was on the board there, but went on to work for Sodexo and was in the had a global role as head of corporate responsibility and diversity, equity, and inclusion, went on to the C-suite in Sodexo North America. So I think there are two things that really sort of grounded me. One is sort of my belief that, I can do anything. And the second is sort of being grounded in who I am and, the authenticity that comes with that. And then I think the third thing would be, the sort of desire to give back and to support particularly other women. And I've, coached hundreds of women, through my career, and continue to do that and continue to give back. So I would say those would be some of the key influences and how they sort of, shaped who I am today.
I love that. I personally, my father, who was an immigrant, came and his story of being involved in, many instances of feeling excluded or not feeling connected. And it really helped shape, I know, my path as well. When people ask me, why did I choose the route of DEI work? I think it's very closely tied to my experiences as a young child, seeing what my father and mother went through, having a sense of not feeling like I'm belonging. And I was curious, with your story and your path and experiences that you said your father went through, how did that shape your decision to go into the path you chose professionally?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, I think everyone has a DEI story. And for those that are involved in DEI work, it's obviously very personal for them. So my father actually went back to India, and I was born in India. I grew up in India. So my story, like yours, Roger, is very integral to who I am. Growing up in Mumbai, pretty much everyone looked like me, similar skin tones. I belonged to the majority religion, Hinduism. And surrounded by others like me, I had the privilege of not really having to think about my identity. So when I moved as a single young immigrant woman to the United States, it was clearly an inflection point in my journey, both literally and metaphorically. And my identity at that point shifted from being a person who really saw herself as the center of the world, someone who could do everything and anything, to being a minority, to being an immigrant, and to being a foreigner. And honestly, I was completely unprepared for that. And it was only when I was identified as a minority did I realize the privileges that came with being part of a majority. You know, I was part of the majority growing up in India, and I hadn't really recognized my privilege in that way. And to be honest, I was unable to till I was perceived as a minority and I experienced things differently. So, you know, this sort of realization that identity is fluid, it's situational, informed the research that I went on to do, and it still informs my work. So this vocation is very personal to me. And understanding what it means to be perceived as a minority, as an outsider, is very much at the heart of DEI work. And, you know, my vocation, I feel that my vocation and my avocation are perfectly aligned. So I rewired from Sodexo, and I continue to do more of the same, which is, you know, my, you know, desire to give back. I continue to do DEI work. I'm on several nonprofit boards. I mentor and coach a lot of women and people from other underrepresented groups. So it definitely has, you know, it's been a very personal journey in terms of my experiences, both, you know, particularly moving to North America. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure we would have a lot to talk about in terms of our stories growing up.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that.
So Rohini, you mentioned the book, and I would love to dig into it because there's so many rich insights to the book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a guide for systemic change in multinational organizations. And, you know, I love that piece on systemic change. And I think in the book you mentioned that in order for us to embark in that systemic change, it does start at that individual level.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I found so appealing, so wonderful and informative in the book is your personal stories and the lessons that you learned. And so I'm wondering if you could share maybe just one or two of those lessons that really stand out to you that are very poignant in terms of your own personal growth and learning in doing this work.
Yeah, so one of the stories that sort of immediately comes to my mind is when I, you know, started to do the global work. One of the, you know, I mentioned I grew up in India, and I went back to India to do global DI work for Sodexo. And I recall very clearly sitting in a room full of entry-level managers, female managers, with about 20 of them. And, you know, I was there to really sort of figure out ways, initiatives to advance their careers. And, you know, as I sat there, I talked about leadership development, I talked about mentoring and how it could play a key role in advancing their careers at Sodexo. And I could see I was just not connecting with this audience. I was just not, you know, they were quiet, respectful. And so I paused and I asked them, I said, you know, help me understand how Sodexo can help you in advancing your careers. And I heard something that was completely unexpected. So one of them very gingerly raised her hand and said, you know, we live in sort of multi-generational joint families in India. And if I work late or if I have to work on a special project, you know, when I go home, I have to take care of the house, I have to take care of the dinner, the meal, and a mother-in-law, because they live in these multi-generational homes with their in-laws, basically, you know, gets upset if we're late coming home. And I had really completely forgotten this, you know, the role of the Indian woman, not just as a mother and a wife, but also as a daughter-in-law. I had completely overlooked this multi-generational family arrangement in India. And I had focused on one aspect of our shared identity, overlooking the many differences. So, it was an early lesson for me to really step back and not impose my worldview, not, have my presumptions as I go into doing global work and carry sort of what I'm, my worldview and what I'm familiar with and impose it, but to step back and to really listen and to understand the context before, addressing a situation. So I think, this whole notion of, we are multidimensional beings, and we have to recognize that and not just sort of have this presumption of, and impose one or come from one worldview and impose that worldview, or assume that, sort of initiatives like leadership development and mentoring, which have worked very well in other parts of the world, are going to work equally, or the answers or solutions in other parts of the world. So not to impose what's worked in one part of the world and other parts of the world. So I think it's a question of constantly working on yourself, because change happens at the intersection of people and processes. So yes, you have to address the processes, but you also have to address yourself and set personal growth that's equally important.
Thank you for listening to the Culture Stew podcast. In a world full of podcasts and endless choices, we're especially grateful that you spent time with us.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Marukian.
And me, Roger Moriano, with operations support by Melissa Gratz.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com. And send us your stories and questions at our email, culturestew@msmglobalconsulting.com.
And please remember to give us a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast platform.
See you next time.